Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and those of you joining us from school or from home, welcome to the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. My name's Erica Whyman, I'm the Deputy Artistic Director here, and we've been having a really fascinating and very energised debate this morning talking about Antony and Cleopatra and women in leadership. We've got quite a short time this afternoon and lots of really fabulous speakers who I'm going to just introduce in just a second. So to give you a sense of how the afternoon is going to work, I'm going to ask my colleagues here just to say a little bit about their area of expertise. They're now all thinking, what's that? But I've got a question to ask each of them. And then I've got a lovely selection of questions, too many probably for the short time that we've got, that have come to me from some of you who are not with us today and the guys who are attending the conference here in Stratford. And I'm going to try and get through as many as possible so that we get a chance to be in a real dialogue about this really fascinating, it seems to me, important question. We started the morning by talking about why this question feels relevant in our lives now, both in our personal lives. How does the question of gender and whether we're a man or a woman affect our attitudes to ambition and to leadership, and in our public lives? We've talked a little bit about events that are in the news, the election in America and whether gender was a factor in that election. The fact that England and Scotland currently have prime ministers or first ministers who are women, and how are those women treated by the media? Is the dialogue different when the leader in question is a woman? And I suppose the room has been very heated and interesting on those questions, and we haven't got a clear conclusion. You'll be pleased to know if you're joining us this afternoon. But rather that there are some really interesting and important questions that arise. We had quite a strong disagreement about, for example, whether a woman in power should or shouldn't use all of the charms at her disposal. I think it was a really good word that someone used. And some people felt very strongly that actually sexual charms, for example, persuading someone through your sexuality, it was something that you shouldn't use in power. And other people felt really strongly that why shouldn't you use that if it's part of your armour, part of the way that you might persuade someone to do something, just as a flavour of some of the conversations we've had. So let me introduce this brilliant panel, and then we will open the conversation when we've said a few things up to the audience here to join in again with that debate. So next to me, very courageously, is Davida, who was great at contributing this morning to the debate, from Rickard's Lodge School in Wimbledon. Yep. Thank you for joining us. Abigail Rokison-Woodall, who teaches at the Shakespeare Institute here in Stratford and writes a lot about Shakespeare's plays. Josette Simon, who is playing Cleopatra right now on this stage, well, not right now, but tonight on this stage, and has been very generous with her time today in talking about the process of playing Cleopatra and thinking about that role. And Iqbal Khan on the end there, who has directed, Josette, has directed the production of Antony and Cleopatra that's part of this season of Roman tragedies at the RSC. So I'm going to start with Abigail. I wonder if you could just give us, and I know it's hard in just a few sentences, a little flavour of how this play arrives or arises in Shakespeare's canon of plays, what the world was when he was writing it, and where you think this comes from, this play.
So when Shakespeare's writing Antony and Cleopatra, James I of England is on the throne. He's been on the throne for about 4 years. Queen Elizabeth has died. Queen Elizabeth, a female ruler like Cleopatra, and it's led a number of critics to argue that the play is in some way nostalgic for the reign of Elizabeth I, and that's something which is very much open to debate. In terms of, I suppose, Queen Elizabeth and Cleopatra, there are certain comparisons that can be drawn. And I think one of the things is that Shakespeare's doing something quite interesting with the story of Antony and Cleopatra, with where it comes from. He's got, his main source material is Plutarch and the life of Marcus Antonius, and that's been translated from the Latin into English, 1579, I think, by Thomas North. So he's got access to this source material, and he creates from that a more nuanced, more attractive Cleopatra than the one that Plutarch gives us. He he makes her motivations more evident, I think. And he changes just some small but quite significant things. For example, when Antony's going to fight at sea, in Plutarch, it is simply Cleopatra who makes that suggestion, and he accepts it, and it sort of is a disaster. But actually in Antony and Cleopatra, what happens is that we hear that it's actually, Antony says, it's because Caesar dares me that I do it. Just something really small like that, which just kind of shifts things slightly. And it's always really important to look at how Shakespeare deals with his source material, because it's often that gives us the biggest insight into what he's thinking and where his sympathies lie, I think.
Thank you very much. That's great. A theme, I think, of the morning is that complexity, there being more than one answer, is really one of the reasons that these plays still feel alive to us now, that we can see ourselves in them in different ways. And he introduces a level of complexity, is what you're suggesting, particularly around Cleopatra. I mean, I know you mentioned that, Josette, that a number of accounts of Cleopatra are not entirely kind or rounded, indeed. I'd love to ask you what you enjoy most about her, what draws you to her, what you admire in her.
What draws me to her? The challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
The challenge of inhabiting and bringing to life Cleopatra in an absolutely truthful way. And do I admire her? Absolutely. I think she is an extraordinary being. I think that's been part of the reason why it's been quite difficult to define her, and people have defined her in quite a narrow way. And a lot of that was instigated by Octavius Caesar, from whom Plutarch took some of his was a great source. And Octavius Caesar, I think as we were saying this morning, was not a fan of Cleopatra. And therefore the things that he wrote were very reductive and diminished her greatly, and concentrated very heavily on her being a very kind of sexualized, flighty creature who was really of very little, had very little intelligence. And the Shakespeare, who, as you say, took a lot of his influence from what Plutarch wrote. However, he was one of the few people who actually gives her more credit for who she is, her status, her ability to run this country, Egypt, single-handedly, and transform it from a country she inherited with great famine, civil war, and turned it into a prosperous and thriving country. You can't do any of that if you don't have a brain. No, you can't do any of that if you're just sexy. So the thing is that, so the challenge, it was a challenge for me. What drew me to her, I also felt very strongly that her political mind, her fine intellectual capabilities should be brought out. It's Shakespeare's, it's in there. And it's something I felt had not always been represented well in past interpretations of Cleopatra.
Thank you. And that immediately gives us an insight into her wonderful complexity, her infinite variety, the sense in which she is also very sexy, she is also very
she's
emotional.
all of the things. Yeah.
She's all of those things,
All
but
of
her
those
brain
things.
is active all the time.
Yeah.
That brings me neatly to Davida. So we were talking about how this relates to our own lives, how this relates to the idea of imagining that one might be a leader, whether you're a man or a woman. And I wonder if I could ask you what kind of role models you think your generation or you look to when you think about leadership, and whether you would like to do that.
I was having this conversation the other day with a friend, and I think the most important thing she did say to me was you have to look for qualities within yourself that you can liken to other people, because if you don't know what you want for yourself, then how are you going to go out there and look for a role model that you feel represents what you would like to be in 10, 20 years' time? So if you don't really look within yourself, then you wouldn't really know what you're looking for, where you're going, where you're heading. If you're going forwards, backwards, up, down, you would never know. So I think the most important thing is looking within yourself and finding within yourself the best qualities, and maybe the ones that aren't so bad or so good, and then liken it to people that you would like to see yourself in that position. So I'm not going to say that I have a specific role model as such, but I'd like to say that I'm working on the qualities and I'm working on looking at the qualities, which I feel will make me a better person, I guess, and liken those to people who are in positions that I'd like to get into, if that makes sense. So I feel, so far, like, I do politics as well as drama, and I am the only girl, there's 3 girls, but I'm the only black girl in my politics class, and I feel like you have to be quite brave to be in that surrounding where your opinions, based on your background, based on what you've been through, don't liken to other people. There's 17 boys, 3 girls, so there's quite a clash of opinions, but I think it's the bravery that you have within you to kind of push through and make sure your voice is heard, which makes it all the more important. So representation.
Yeah,
as
great.
well.
That's a brilliant answer. It's a brilliant answer for the future of humanity, so that's all right, no pressure. But it's a brilliant answer when we talk about Shakespeare, because we often say when we're making his plays and in rehearsal rooms with his texts that he gets inside human beings in a way that playwrights before him didn't, and often playwrights writing after him have not done so successfully. So for you to turn that question on its head and say, actually, it's about what's inside, is fascinating. And as we talk about Antony and Cleopatra, I suppose both Antony and Cleopatra are not as other people expect them to be. So they're having to have that courage to say, this is who I am, this is what I want, precisely that value that you identify. That's brilliant. So starting there, I'm going to start just touching on some questions that have been asked by you guys. And the first one, which I'm really grateful for, because we might not have asked him otherwise, is to Iqbal, which is, what has been your greatest challenge in directing the production?
I think the most difficult thing is the fact that, unlike a lot of these plays, this play has something like 52 scenes. Compared to the usual sort of 20 at the most. So he's telling a massive story, and he's telling it in an incredibly ambitious way, I mean, almost like a film script. He's jumping across the world and across time with incredible courage. That doesn't make it always easy to stage. I mean, particularly when you have the domestic relationships, Antony and Cleopatra, and all the emotional things that are going on, with the backdrop of all the political conversations and negotiations, and to make that a coherent, easy to follow experience for an audience is not straightforward. And I don't think I've ever seen a production where I think that's been completely satisfying in marrying those two things. So that was the biggest challenge,
yes.
was looking at the range of characters that come on for a scene much later on that we have no connection with, and trying to kind of reduce the number of characters so we follow the trajectory of characters throughout. And every one of their movements through the play tells us a story. And to maybe reduce some of the scenes, to change some of the order of the scenes, so that we could tell this story in a more coherent way for a modern audience. I think that was the biggest challenge. And also to try and keep alive the things that you were talking about, which are these open questions, which is, for me, peculiar to Shakespeare, is that he hardly ever presents you with a conclusive view on anything. You have multiple viewpoints presented throughout. And so he's the most humane writer, I think, in the English language for that reason, is that he doesn't provide you with definitive answers. He presents positions. And to keep all of that alive, to keep it interesting and coherent, is, I think, the greatest challenge when approaching these plays.
And just to follow up on that, because that was a question from Jacob, I should have said. This next question relates to that, which is from one of the audience members who are watching online. And they ask, if we talk about Cleopatra as being a strong leader, do you think that women are treated differently in Egypt to the way that they are in Rome, in the play?
Yeah.
That's one of the challenges you're talking about, but the scope of it is two cultures, exactly. Two worlds.
I mean, certainly in Shakespeare's view, the world that Shakespeare is presenting here, the women are very, very dominant, and particularly in our production. I think Charmian, Iris, and Cleopatra have such a powerful presence in that court. There's this much more kind of gender fluidity as well around them in that court, whereas the codes of behavior, gender codes in Rome are very different. And even though in Rome you have in Octavia, Caesar's sister, who marries Antony in the course of the play, she becomes the most powerful woman in the world because of that. But within Roman society, she doesn't really have a public voice. So and Cleopatra, who is perhaps the most vital person throughout the whole course of the play, it doesn't have anything like the same level of global influence that someone like an Octavia would have. So yeah, there's a massive difference in the worlds.
That marriage is interesting because it seems to me it's reflected in a few marriages in Shakespeare, that sense of he seems keenly aware that the woman is being given as a kind of prize and
it's
a
a contract.
seal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That brings me to a question for Abigail from, I think, Frisk, if I'm reading that rightly, who says, do you think that Shakespeare wrote a strong woman leader because he was ahead of his time? Or do you think it was because he was mocking the idea that a woman could be a strong leader?
I think it's probably slightly dangerous for us to talk about Shakespeare as being ahead of his time, because he is inevitably a product of the time in which he lived. We can see that in a number of his attitudes towards race and gender, which are, I suppose, what we would call part of the dominant ideology of his time. So I'm thinking of things like, we often get references to womanly tears, we get references to weakness in relation to women. And yet, Shakespeare does write some fantastically strong female characters, and he does turn on their head some expectations, things which women, according to the Elizabethans, women couldn't rule. They were far too emotional. Women couldn't take positions like being lawyers, for example, because they were far too emotional and unreliable. And yet in another of Shakespeare's plays, The Merchant of Venice, he has a female character dress up as a man and succeed in doing what none of the men can do at that point. So I think in terms of his depiction of Cleopatra, I certainly don't think he's doing the second thing of mocking the idea that you could have a strong female ruler. And remember, they know you can have a strong female ruler because they've had Elizabeth I, and actually her reign was pretty successful. But I think he's doing what we've been talking about. He's creating some very nuanced characters. And I think Cleopatra has suffered from a literary critical history which has seen Cleopatra as kind of changeable and unreliable and all the things that actually Antony is as well. And in fact, Shakespeare's creating two very human characters, and as Josette has already said, a woman who is more than capable of ruling.
I have to say, I slightly disagree with you on one point, which is that I do think Shakespeare was ahead of his time.
Right?
Yes, I don't think he was writing to be ahead of his time, or because he was ahead of his time, but I think that when you look at quite a few of his very different and remarkable female characters, I think they are operating in a way that I think was not only ahead of his time, but even today is. You know, he has characters like Beatrice and in Much Ado About Nothing, or Rosaline in Love's Labour's Lost, where they are unmarried, they're themselves, they're independent, they have independent thoughts, they're strong, they're sort of they're unashamedly themselves, and you know, Rosalind, I mean, as you like it, you know, it has a wisdom that far outweighs the men around her. I mean, I've always been marvelled at the way that Shakespeare's been able to get inside a female head, a female psyche, given that A is a man and B he was writing at that time. So that's just my personal view. I think, I've always thought he was ahead of his time in what he wrote at that time, which is still relevant today and still so incredibly knowledgeable about being a female. I think it's astonishing. That's my view.
Yeah, thank you. I really agree. But it's interesting, Iqbal and I were just touching earlier on the fact that he also silences his women sometimes. Yeah. And what one makes of that. Do you want to say a bit about how that functions in the play?
It's one of those things where I think the great thing about Shakespeare is that he gets into whatever race the character is, whatever gender they are, he gets into what makes them human, the complexity of them as a human being. But it is complicated. I mean, I think in Antony and Cleopatra, and I think Cleopatra is perhaps his most complex female character. Even with Cleopatra in the second half, she goes very silent for a long time in scenes where you're screaming to hear what's going on inside of her. I would suggest it's complicated. It's difficult when it comes to how much he explores the interiority, the interior language of his female characters. I mean, they gives them very few soliloquies, and generally the soliloquies are to do with what should I do, what am I doing, what's just happened, narrative stuff, not who am I, what is my identity. And even with Cleopatra, I mean, there are reasons for that. I think in Antony and Cleopatra in the second half, he wants to put us in Antony's place, where we're kind of going, what is her real motive? What will she? Where are her allegiances? So I think there are dramatic reasons for why he does it, but it is problematic, I think.
Although I'm struck by a couple of the women on the panel feeling like he's, I'm including myself, feeling like he's quite accurate about it. And I wonder if that's partly because that is often our experience of public life.
Exactly.
That we're not treated as agents.
Yeah. But there's a great contrast. Later this year, in The Swan, we're doing Marlowe's Dido, Queen of Carthage, slightly earlier play. Yes. And there you have a woman right at the centre of the action who is given full voice throughout the piece. Really spectacularly unusual. So I think there are reasons why, exactly as you say, I think there's a reason why the voice is missing when we want to hear it in the second half, because that is the experience of women in that context.
But for me, as Cleopatra, I
Go on, sorry. Ask Cleopatra.
I have to find reasons why I'm not saying as much. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I can't say, right, this is a problem, and he's silenced. You know, you've got to find a truthful reason why you're not saying very much, and that's believable. Part of that for me is that the thing about Cleopatra is when other people are starting to fall apart or fracture, Cleopatra, and during the course of the second half, that's what happens. Everything starts going wrong. It goes right for a little bit, but then it all starts, and it's becoming clear that things are going downhill. And the thing is that Cleopatra is never defeatist, and Cleopatra never fractures. I mean, she might have moments when things become out of control, but she never. I remember saying in rehearsal that she never cracks. She calculates. So things are starting to go a bit. You know, Cleopatra's mind will be in overdrive about how best to get out of this situation. What's the best course to take? What action should I do in order to facilitate what I want to happen? You know, I mean, she, you know, so for some of that second half, when she's not saying much,
absolutely,
in my mind, she's calculating what's the best course to take. And she takes in everything. She doesn't miss anything. She doesn't miss anybody. She doesn't miss anything has happened. She's finely tuned. And so she'll be thinking strategically rather than saying a lot.
Yeah. Yes, very good. I'm going to take us to a slightly different question, but I think it might very well bring us back there. So there's a great question from Sophie, which I'm going to ask Davida, but feel free everyone to pitch in. The question was, to what extent has the sexualisation of women in the media caused young girls to shy away from leadership roles? And of course, it feels like a brilliant question in relation to the play, because Cleopatra does use all of the tools at her disposal, both in love and in politics. So how do you respond to that question, Davida?
Earlier on in the first half, we were having a conversation about how women use their charms, their sexual charms, to their advantage. And I think one point that I think a girl in the audience made was it devalues merit. If you use your charms to... Some of us agreed that, yeah, you should use your charms to your advantage, but I thought what me and the girl had in mind, which was quite similar, is that it devalues your hard work.
Yes.
If you use that to your advantage, then how did you get there? Did you sleep with him? Did you? Did you work hard? Did you flirt your way through? It devalues if you did try your hardest. And I think it's really important to focus on, as men and women, boys and girls, I think we should really focus on the level of meritocracy.
Yes.
And how it applies to men and how it applies to women. So I also do sociology, and we were looking at how when boys succeed in their 11+ exams before comprehensive school system, you know, girls had to do 10 times better. And I think it's that thing of, okay, for boys it's okay, you can get along doing the bare minimum, but girls, you have to push harder.
Yes.
And it's this whole thing of breaking the glass ceiling. Why do we have to do that? Why is there a glass ceiling? Why can't it just be an equal run for all of us? Some of us are running a relay with no hurdles, and then some of us are running a relay with hurdles, obstacles, bouncy castle in the middle. So I feel it's really important to, and this whole thing of sexualization, I think it's also important for girls to also own their sexuality.
Yes.
Whether it be, if you choose to be provocative with it, then that's your problem, that's your business. But if you choose to own your sexuality behind closed doors, which I think is interesting in the play of Cleopatra, because we see her in so many different dynamics. We don't see her as just sexy but brainless. We see her sexy, brainless, mysterious, cunning, mischievous. We see her in so many different lights, and I think it's important for society to recognise that there's so many different aspects to a woman.
Yes.
Which we could all learn from, not just as girls, but all of us.
Thank you, that's brilliant. I think that really captures some of our discussions this morning, that we don't want to pretend that sex isn't part of the way that we interact with each other and part of our power and part of who we are and our identity. But when it gets muddled, so that actually it becomes the only important thing and we can't see beyond it to other things that are to be merited, then that's a problem. I guess the question also asks, are we in a world where women are put off from leadership roles because of some of these complexities? I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up. You think yes?
Definitely. I think, especially coming from the background where I come from, like we've just started A-levels, but 7 months in, I remember having this conversation again in year 11. Oh, I want to pick maths, I want to pick physics. Actually, no, not really, because I'll be the only girl in the class. So it's
being alone and breaking that glass ceiling
like
by yourself. Yeah.
If one person doesn't do that, then the rest of us won't. But it's that first person to kind of go through and be like, yeah, sure, I'll go through it.
Yes.
And I think it's, as well as being not afraid to break stereotypes, I think it's also being afraid to kind of stick to the stereotype. You know, there's 4 girls in my drama class, very stereotypical, but that's what I like, that's what I picked. And I think it's the strength to stay with what you think is true to what you like, which is, again, what Cleopatra is. I think a lot of women can take away from that is what she thinks, it was what she thinks, and she can't be swayed, and she can't be persuaded to see the male side of it, and she can't be dumbed down, which is really important as well.
See, I think that's very important because in the play and in people's perceptions today about Cleopatra, because so many people before I started rehearsing would tell me, oh, you're playing Cleopatra, she's this, she's that, she's that. They told me what they thought, and it's the point where I had to say, I'm sure it's very interesting, and I don't mean to be rude or anything, but that's your subjective view, and I don't really want to hear it, because I don't want anything stuck in my own head. I have to start from a clean slate. But I think what's clear in the play, and what is also clear in real life, is that actually Cleopatra is unashamedly herself. Yes. She's herself. She won't be anybody else but who she is. And yes, she uses all manner of ways to get what she wants, including her sexuality. But even then, if you think of Julius Caesar, with whom she had liaison and bore his son, and Mark Antony, two of the most powerful men in the world, both of these men had a history of many, many women. Beautiful, gorgeous, wonderful women. Both of them were captivated by Cleopatra, who had, as much going on as some of these other women. So it cannot be that is the only thing about her. I don't think either of these men would have been so struck or wanted to be with her if she was only sexy and playful and delightful and charming and all the rest of it. And I think, again, I have to bring back this thing about Cleopatra's mind, which I think is something that attracts Antony as well as all the other stuff, and is something that attracted Julius Caesar. I don't think either of them would have stayed around if she was just one thing. And I'll finish in a minute. Sorry. But I think what happened with her, and what still happens, is that if people can't quite work out a woman, if she has intellectual capability and is attractive, or even if people don't find her attractive or whatever, people feel they can't work her out, they can't control her, they don't know quite what to do with her, they have to diminish her. Yes. They have to diminish her. And I think this is one of the things that when you talk about young women going into politics or things where they're the only one, I think it is a daunting prospect, only because you're going to be judged, as this whole discussion is about, in quite different ways to a man. You might have exactly the same capabilities, but you are going to be judged, and so it's going to be harder, and that's why we do need to see more. But also, people can be frightened of a strong woman who owns herself and who has a fine mind and is unashamedly herself. It's so threatening and frightening to a lot of people that they can't control it, so they have to find some way to put it in a little box and say that you're just this. And I think that still exists today. Certainly was the same in her case.
And if I might say so, also glorious to see, because it's so rare. So you have, both of you, Davida and Josette, answered a question, I think, from Alex, just so I just put that in context, which was, do you think Cleopatra's leadership style is still relevant today? It feels like you very much touched on that, because actually from your very first answer, it's about being yourself. And that is perhaps not a style, but an approach to being alive, which feels very relevant. But
we do know that the media, I mean, there have been some sort of comedy articles about it, but if the media treated male politicians, it treats female politicians by describing everything they're wearing before they start to describe anything they've said. It's still something that is really quite problematic in terms of the focus on women's appearance.
Last word to Davida, very good.
I was just going to say as well, I think what this play does is show that being a woman and being in a position of leadership isn't mutually exclusive. You can do both at the same time. And I think that's a really important message, that to girls who want to do everything, there's people like, oh, you can't have kids, which I think is also another thing, that if you haven't had kids and you don't have a family, you've got this brilliant life, you're successful, you've done what you need to do. If you don't have a family, then you're a failure. But as I was saying, women who want to do it all, people are like, you can't do all of that. You can. You can. If you work hard, you can. Definitely you'll be able to.
Very good. Thank you. That seems like the absolute perfect way to end. I'm sorry if we've run over by a minute or two. Thank you all very, very much for listening. If you're not here with us in Stratford, and look forward to hearing from you soon.